On today's show, training camp is rapidly approaching for the Atlanta Hawks. About 2.5 weeks to go until things get underway in Atlanta. And we'll get into your mailbag questions on today's podcast. And all of that is coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1797 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Thursday afternoon/evening here in mid-September. And today's podcast is sponsored by the folks at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and then use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase with Game Time. I also want to encourage you at the top of the podcast, as I always do on the show, to make us your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Hawks. Check us out and search Locked On Hawks anywhere you find podcasts. We are on Apple, we're on Spotify, Overcast. We're also on YouTube. Please like this episode as you are watching it on that platform. And please do us a favor if you are a YouTube watcher and also subscribe and download on the audio side. Definitely helps the show to grow in the future. And yeah, it's been busy on this podcast, as it always is. We've been having guests on in the recent past, like Glenn Willis on the podcast earlier this week, talking about Onyeka Okongwu in two-part fashion. That is definitely worth listening to if you haven't already. Last week, it was Brian Schroeder on the podcast, talking about some 2025 NBA draft. Glenn's been on a number of times. Tyler Jones has been on the podcast, et cetera, et cetera. Been very busy on the show, and we're also ramping up the volume of episodes a little bit, starting quite soon. In fact, next week, we're kind of all systems go. Regular season mode from this point forward, basically, which means more episodes in your feeds. Games will be starting pretty soon. So if you're a new listener, what we do is ramp things up. We're always here for you 12 months a year, but even busier for you when the games are actually happening. So here we go with all of that. Speaking of training camp, however, though, there's a little bit of an announcement on Thursday. I've been kind of referring to this openly about the timing of media day and training camp for the Hawks all summer long, really, and referencing that repeatedly on the show, but it wasn't like quote unquote officially announced until today. The Hawks did that on Thursday morning. Monday, media day is officially, as I've been saying for a while, Monday, September 30th. So about 2.5 weeks from now in Atlanta, as it has been pretty much forever. But then a little bit of a wrinkle this year, training camp for the Hawks, at least the first 3 days of training camp, is actually going to be happening at UGA up in Athens. So it begins on Tuesday, October 1st. Basically, they come in for media day, spend that whole day talking to us. Then the actual on-court portion begins on Tuesday. 3 days of camp at UGA. It hasn't happened in a while, but it did actually happen a lot when I first started covering the team under the Mike Budenholzer regime. I think it was 4 or 5 years in a row they had that. They had camp in Athens. You might ask why that is. I got some questions about that today when I kind of announced that. There's not really a reason. It's other than just getting away from where you actually are. Teams view this differently. Basically, there are teams that go like across the country or go to Hawaii, or take a long trip on purpose to kind of get away with the team building, all that stuff. Some teams kind of meet in the middle by not going too far, like the Hawks are about to do, going to Athens. You're getting away from normal, but not necessarily too far. It's not inconvenient, etc. And then there are teams that just do it in their practice facility, which the Hawks have done in the last few years in Brookhaven near Atlanta. So no rhyme or reason beyond just like what the team wants to do there. But, Quinn Snyder, year 2 in full, and they're going back to UGA where they have not been since 2017. Okay, and by the way, from there, they come back to Atlanta after the 3 days in Athens, and they have a few more days of camp, and then the preseason opener is October 8th. So it's about a week after camp begins. So it's not a hugely long process. Obviously, there are practices in between games, but the only training camp, quote unquote, portion of the preseason schedule is that first week. And after that, it's kind of like full systems go and all speed ahead to the season. All right, from here, a bunch of mailbag questions to get to on today's podcast. And we'll start with one from Kelly, who says, I was looking at betting odds, came across what I think might actually be a mistake on Bogdan Bogdanovic's line to win 6th man of the year at 50-1. I bet it immediately, and then I realized that maybe it is because he could start for the team this year. What do you think about his potential to win 6th man of the year? So I'll probably do a little bit more of a formal betting guide through our folks at FanDuel, a sponsor of this podcast, and using those odds closer to the season. This is one that was interesting, and I went looking for myself. Actually, after I pulled this question, I got another one from a different person on Twitter saying they actually saw Bogey at 80-1 somewhere, which is pretty crazy. But I don't know where Kelly saw this, not part of the question, but FanDuel right now, our friends there, have Bogey at 40-1 to win 6th man of the year as of Thursday afternoon. I find that to be pretty crazy. And I do think that, to Kelly's point, I'm not sure it's a mistake, but it is a line that is, I think, quite valuable on the handicapping side. So for reference, there are currently 14 players with better odds to win Sixth Man of the Year at FanDuel right now. A couple of them are pretty obvious, like Malik Monk and Naz Reid. They were the top two last year in the actual voting. They're 1-2 in odds. That's kind of how it usually goes. Josh Hart's up there, Alex Caruso and his new team, Jaime Jaquez in Miami, etc. But Bogey has worse odds than guys like Russell Westbrook in Denver, Ben Mathurin in Indiana, Malcolm Brogdon on a bad Wizards team. Like, that kind of blows my mind, honestly, from an odds perspective. If you've been listening to the podcast this summer, or really even before this summer, you will know that I thought Bogey should have won Sixth Man of the Year last year, or at the very least been in the top three pretty comfortably. And I think if the Hawks had won more games, he would have gotten more attention appropriately for that award. And it's not his fault, of course. I think that I think you have to project Bogey to play fewer games than last year. Now, I did a whole discussion in 2 parts with Glenn Willis about a week or 2 ago on Bogey, which you should listen to if you have not already on this feed. But to summarize, he played so much last year from a game perspective of 79 games. You kind of have to project a little bit less than that. But he was so good on a per game basis, and he just had a fairly traditional profile for the award. Like Sixth Man of the Year has never been my favorite award. It usually is just like a high scoring perimeter player with very little context. Guys who play defense are often undervalued, et cetera, et cetera. But Bogey scores points. He closes games, plays a lot of minutes. That usually is a good recipe for Sixth Man of the Year. But the only rational explanation I have for why FanDuel might have him at 40-1 right now is to the point of the question. He might just start too many games. And I use might on purpose. He might start too many games because the only qualifier for Sixth Man of the Year is the player has to come off the bench more often than he starts. So unlike MVP and All-NBA, there's no games minimum, although you kind of have to have enough games to really qualify as far as like in voters' minds. But let's just say, for example, Bogey played 67 games this season. He'd only have to start 33 games or less to be eligible for Sixth Man of the Year. For instance, like you're allowed to start games. Last year, Naz Reid won it. He started 14 games. Like it's fine. Tyler Hero won it 1 year with a bunch of starts. You can still make 25 starts and win the award. But I've been doing this bit all summer long. I'll do it one more time right now. I still think as of September 12th, as I'm recording this podcast, there are really only 2 guys that are absolutely locked in to be starters for the Hawks this year, and it's Trae Young and Jalen Johnson. Obviously, there'll be a center, so either Clint or Nyeko will be out there, but I stand by all of that until training camp happens so we get more information. Bogey was arguably their second best player last year on a per minute basis, and I'm not saying that willy-nilly. Like, he had the best metrics on the team other than Trae last year, pretty comfortably actually, and he's still one of their top 3 guys. If you ask me, pick your best player list on the Hawks right now for one game, Bogey would be either number 2 or number 3 with Jalen somewhere, pretty comfortably. With that said, he may not start. Last year was this, as I just said, the similar case, and he didn't start because the Hawks liked him in that role. It worked for him. It worked for the team. They were able to kind of ramp things up. And this year especially, I think he and Trae are going to have to stagger. So having him off the bench makes it a little bit easier to do that. We will see if they do that or not. But if you're buying into uncertainty, like there is some for sure, but you're doing that with any Sixth Man of the Year bet because anybody could be forced into the starting lineup with any role change. Like Malik Monk could end up starting for the Kings if something happens to force that. Naz Reid is one injury to Karl Towns or Rudy Gobert away from starting too many games. Like it's kind of an odd award through that lens. But it is also crazy to me that it's 40-1. Like, yes, Bogey could start too many games to win it. That is built in. It should be built into your handicap on this if you want to go through that lens. But that's still too high. For reference, for a bet to have value at 40-1, it only has to win like 3% of the time or better. And this definitely is going to win 3% of the time or better, in my opinion. That's my opinion. Of course, it's all subjective. I'm not telling anybody what to do with their money. But I feel safe in saying if you simulated this coming season a million times, Bogey will win Sixth Man of the Year more than 3% of the time. So that means, in my mind, it's a good value. If you are into that kind of thing, dive in if you'd like to. Check out the folks at FanDuel as always. And yes, to answer the question, Kelly, good value. I think it's a good bet for you, and we'll see if it wins down the line. All right, I do have one more thing coming up on Sixth Man of the Year, and also some more mailbag questions, of course, on this podcast. But first, a word from our partners on today's show. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors and passion, drive, and patience. So it's formula of winning championships. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive from a vehicle perspective. At eBay Motors, they have all stuff that you need to maintain your vehicle, also to level it up to make it the best it could possibly be for peak performance. They have roof racks, they have exhaust kits, they have LED headlights, superchargers, etc. Whether you're into speed, into power, or into style, they have you covered across the board at eBay Motors. Over 122 million parts. 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for with the folks at eBay Motors. They also have eBay Guaranteed Fit, which means your parts guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber, but you are not burning any cash. Of all the parts that you need at the price that you're looking for, it's easy to turn that car or truck or SUV that you have into the MVP that you want and bring home that win that you are seeking. Keep your ride or die alive right now at ebaymotors.com. One more time, the place to go is ebaymotors.com. eBay Guarantee Fit is available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Okay, before the next question, I do have one more thought on Sixth Man of the Year, and that is that DeAndre Hunter actually is listed at 40-1 at FanDuel to win the award. It is crazy to me, I'll say this, that he and Bogey have the same odds. That in itself is silly, which kind of tells you that I think that Bogey is a great bet. With that said, if you ignore Bogey for a second, I think Hunter's odds are like pretty reasonable, if not pretty attractive in some respects. Now, I understand Hawks fans in general are not in love with DeAndre Hunter right now. I don't blame you. He is a flawed player. He kind of is what he is going into year 6. I will acknowledge that. But he is, and by the way, he has started pretty much the entire time he's been in Atlanta. But just like Bogey, he has a less than defined role as far as starting is concerned. But there's definitely a chance this year that he does not start, number one. And if you knew that right now, I think Hunter would be pretty reasonable at 41. Now, you don't know that right now, but if you knew that he wasn't going to start, it would make some sense. So hear me out. There's a path to him playing like 28 minutes a game, something like that, without starting as the backup 3 and the backup 4. You know, behind Ricochet or behind Daniels or behind Krejci or whatever at the 3, behind Jalen at the 4. Last year, as many people noticed that were paying attention, sort of close attention to Hunter, he played quite well coming off the bench post-injury. Eventually, he ended up starting again, but he played 20 games last year off the bench, which was a career high in games off the bench. He averaged 16 points a game, which is pretty good. And he was 63% true shooting in about 26-ish minutes per game. So if that was just, obviously you can assume that's going to be the case, but if that was extractable, that would be a Sixth Man of the Year kind of case. That efficiency, that scoring. I think his defense is overrated by some nationally and underrated by some locally, if that makes sense. But I'm not saying to do that. I think Bogey's a much, much, much better value than DeAndre Hunter. But like, I understand that looks funny because it does. But I think Hunter at 40-1 is actually like not insane if you knew that he wasn't going to start. There you go. Okay. Question from Ryan, who says, I'm just curious on Nikola Djurisic. I have no idea the salary differences between playing for a team in Europe or just being on a G League team. Is there a world where the Hawks just have Djurisic play in College Park this season instead of going back to Europe? So as a refresher here, if you don't know this, Djurisic was the 43rd pick in the draft this year. The Hawks acquired him back in June with a couple of moves involving AJ Griffin and cash around the draft. Then he broke his foot. So he had surgery on July 22nd to repair his 5th metatarsal bone in his left foot after that injury happened at the beginning of Summer League. And right now, September 12th, he doesn't have a contract for the Hawks. They have his draft rights, of course. They don't go away. But at this moment, the Hawks have a full roster, 15 guys, and they have a full two-way allotment of 3 players. So barring a trade, or maybe they choose to like cut Cody Zeller. That's like conceivable, I guess, to me. But barring a move of some kind, there's not a path to have Djurisic on the actual Hawks roster this year. It's not unusual to have a player be stashed in Europe that's drafted in the 40s. I actually asked Landry Fields about that the day after the draft, and he didn't rule that out at that point in time. We didn't know that was that's pre-injury, that's pre-offseason move, so it was a lot of uncertainty. Now, I get questions all the time about this, about like what's going on with Djurisic. And all I will say is the injury would have made it even more likely to stash him because there's just less utility in him being on the roster. But the biggest thing is the roster being full. I've never heard, though, at the same time, that the Hawks are definitely going to stash him. That has not been said by anyone on or off the record to me. No one said that to me. Now, they might just keep their powder dry. I'm sure they probably have a plan for him, but they've not articulated that plan at this point in time. And as for the injury timeline, the Hawks announced the next formal update on Djurisic is not going to be until November, which is like 3.5 months post-surgery, but that's into the regular season. The regular season opener is in October. So even if he was miraculously healed, he, A, not under contract, and B, he's a rookie. He's not going to help you a lot this year anyway, in my opinion. So as far to the question, whether he's in the G League or what, like there's a chance, it's not impossible, that he could play in the G League. Or he can go abroad, make some more money, Hawks retain his rights, etc. The thing is, G League salaries, and like I'm talking about non-two-way, just pure G League salaries, are very low. For a player drafted this year to take a G League contract would be a bit strange. It wouldn't be unprecedented, but it would be strange, and it would be cheap for all parties. Not a good way for the player. Or obviously the Hawks wouldn't mind that because he'd be around, but the agent will be involved in the process. I'm sure the agent would like to go get a real contract in Europe to stash over there. Obviously, the best case scenario in some respects would have to be on a two-way in Atlanta or on a long-term, cheap, team-friendly deal on a regular contract. But again, flexibility-wise, they're not quite there yet. But this is a team, and I'll talk about this, I'm sure, a lot more in the next couple of weeks. This is a team that certainly could make a trade in training camp, whether it be to trade Larry Nance. That's the one I get asked about the most nationally because he's not bound on the team, and he's kind of expendable with the way he's on the team with Capella and Okongwu. They could even trade Capella. It wouldn't stun me. But like a Nance trade, a Cody Zeller salary dump kind of trade to clear a roster spot could happen. There's some stuff that could happen still on the margins. But right now, it's certainly worth asking, and I've asked the same question. Like, it's just holding pattern still on Djurisic. If I had to guess right now, you could maybe get me to guess narrowly that he's on a stash contract, but I just don't know, and I wouldn't tell you that I did know if I didn't. So they could just agree, basically, they probably have at this point, to kind of keep it in limbo for a while longer as they wait this out, see what happens. You know, for instance, they could give, if something happens to create a spot, you give Djurisic a contract. If you want to give him a two-way, maybe you promote Dom Barlow, who's like an overqualified two-way guy, to a full contract. We'll see. There are options, but as unsatisfying as that is, it's basically a holding pattern right now, and they haven't let the info out at this point in time as to what the plan actually is for Djurisic. So it's a little bit weird. I understand that, to have a player that you just drafted that fans want to see and have him not be under contract at all. But that's where they are. And look, if tomorrow they announce that Djurisic is signing a contract somewhere in Europe, I won't fall on the floor. But if they don't, we'll have to hold on until training camp. And if nobody else asks the question at media day, I'll be asking it about what Landry has to say about kind of where things are on that. But the injury does cloud things. He just won't be around. He won't be on the court. And that makes it a little bit like out of sight, out of mind, I would say, at this stage. Okay, I have one more question actually about Djurisic in a second, and then one more at the end of the podcast, but probably coming anyway. But first, though, a word from our partners on the podcast today. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is the best place to find tickets. There's nothing like checking out a live event, whether you're into music or theater or comedy or, of course, sports. They have a new feature at Game Time called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets even easier for you. They take out the filter of all the stuff that you actually don't need and only show you the incredible deals that they actually have on great seats. No wasting time, searching through thousands of different tickets. For example, there are awesome deals this weekend for Braves-Dodgers, a big showdown in Atlanta on the baseball side, including a pair of tickets that I just found on Game Time for $16 each, including fees, for the game on Monday night in Atlanta. That's an awesome deal, of course, and there are even more of that, of course, happening all the time at Game Time. Plus, my favorite feature of all, basically, is that you can view seats through the all-in pricing, so there are no surprise fees at the checkout screen at the end. Also, get a view from your seats in the app before you buy them. You know exactly what you're getting into when you actually get to the seats, and you're getting the lowest possible price guarantee with the folks at Game Time. Take all the guesswork out of buying tickets with the Game Time app. Download the Game Time app right now, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, and when you do that promo code, it is LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download the Game Time app today. What time is it? It's game time. All right, question from Alex, who says, I was having a true sicko argument with a friend, and we want you to settle it for us. Who is more helpful to the Hawks, or who is a better prospect between Nikola Djurisic and Dom Barlow? So this is incredibly sicko. This is some September stuff, which I definitely appreciate. But you come to the right place, of course. This is a sicko podcast in some ways. So we'll end with this one, at least for the basketball questions on this one. We'd have one more coming in a moment. But I know Djurisic was in this draft class, of course. Barlow's been in the league for 2 years, but Barlow's actually older by like only a few months. So they're basically the same age. And it's basically known versus unknown for me to answer this question. You could argue that the upside of Djurisic as a big guard with the theoretical ability to score and pass would bring some more upside. I would get that actually as an argument. But in general, he hasn't done it at the highest level that Barlow has. So like, I would almost always lean to the guy who has been better at a higher level, and Barlow has been already one of the best players in the G League last year and a pretty productive NBA player in small sample sizes last year in San Antonio. So I think for this year, it's definitely Barlow, not even close because of the injury to Djurisic. But even before the injury, I would have said Barlow for sure. He's just done more. I would have been pretty shocked even pre-injury if Djurisic was going to help the Hawks at all this year at the highest level because, just not the archetype for that. I famously believe that most rookies are not very good. Path to playing time, all those things just wasn't really there for him. But now missing a bunch of time with a fractured foot, may not be in Atlanta, as we just talked about a second ago on the podcast. Barlow may not help either. I will say that. He's on a two-way contract. There is no lock that he's going to help you this year. But he was decent again in the NBA last year for San Antonio. And especially if the Hawks end up trading someone like Capella or Nance, there's a path to playing time. It's much cleaner for Barlow than it would be for Djurisic. Like, Barlow might be better than Mogay right now because I understand Mogay is a high-ceiling player long-term, but he barely played last year where Barlow was really, really good in the G League. So, like, if it comes down to, like, for instance, if in October, if the Hawks get a couple injuries and they have to pick between Barlow and Gay as, like, who's going to help them win games, it's probably Barlow in some respects. So, anyway, long-term, I still lean Barlow. It's a little bit closer than it would be short-term on this question. I like him a little bit more as a prospect. I would have had a higher grade on him at this stage, independent of team context, and the age gap is kind of like negligible between the two. It would not shock me if Djurisic is better, for sure, because there's a lot to like with him too. But I would give the quote unquote better prospect nod to Barlow as of right now. But God bless you, Alex, and your friend for this argument. You're speaking my language on that one to a varying degree. One more newsy thing, by the way, before we get out of here. Pertains to the Hawks a little bit. I got some questions about this in the last couple of days. There was some TV deal reporting stuff in the last couple of days again. NBA Commissioner Adam Silver talked to the media on Tuesday around the league's Board of Governors meeting, and he discussed the regional sports network situation. I referenced this a couple weeks ago on the podcast about how the reporting was kind of pointing to the Hawks and the other teams that they have on Diamond Sports Group being on Bally again for this coming season. Silver confirmed that Diamond Sports, which owns Bally, that's the Bally side, promised the NBA this summer that it would be operating this season for the teams that are under contract. So that includes the Hawks. Also, he admitted, Silver did, that the 13 teams, which includes the Hawks, took, quote, significantly lower fees, end quote, for this season to ensure they'd be on the networks. So that isn't like playing a salary cap for the Hawks this year or anything like that, but it's less money for Tony Ressler and company to pocket this year. But also, Silver talked about how around the league, like, we'll be spending a lot of time in the next few months kind of monitoring this and figuring it out, because this is the last year that's like kind of a little bit more set. After this, it's like totally up in the air. There's been Amazon reports. There's been all kinds of uncertainty. Not an expert on this, but this year it seems like it's pretty likely. I won't say definite, but pretty likely that Bally's going to be where you find your Hawks games. But we will see after that because it could change rapidly and in a big way. Okay, last question comes from Gio, who says, are you a podcast listener? What NBA shows or sports shows are you subscribed to? So when I say people should subscribe to the podcast, number one, of course, it helps me. It helps the show. And I do mean that. Please subscribe to the podcast and tell your friends. But I'm also a huge podcast listener. And it's big for me to gather information and have stuff in my ears basically all day long. I listen to a lot of shows at faster speeds, candidly. I take a lot of information from that. Like, while I'm working, I have my AirPods in all the time. I'm that guy. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I consume a lot of podcasts. That's what I do. Instead of listening to music or whatever, it's podcasts. On the NBA side, I'll just name some. Forgive me for missing some, but I'm sure I'll miss some. But anyway, of course, Locked On NBA. I should tell you that. That's a good place to start your day with the second listen, I'll say, after this first listen of the Locked On Hawks podcast. Also, Locked On Fantasy Basketball is a great show with Josh Lloyd. Even if you're not a huge fantasy person, Josh is very good at like covering the NBA. Listen to that one. No Dunks, which is formerly the starters, the Basketball Jones. They're over at the Athletic. OGs, those guys are great. The Dunker Spot with Nikias and Steve Jones. Great show there. Dunked On. I was actually on Dunked On this week talking about the Hawks. Game Theory with Sam Vecini, my good friend there. ESPN has a bunch of shows. Low Post, Hoop Collective, great shows there. Ball Don't Lie at Yahoo is a good show. The Just Basketball Show with Chris Manning, Brendan Clean, and Wes Goldberg is a good show. Read and React with Ben Ladner has been on this podcast many times, and John Sauber. The list goes on, but there's a lot of NBA shows and a lot of good NBA shows to listen to. I also listen to like a lot of college basketball stuff. I would say Ion College Basketball at CBS is my favorite one there. Effectively Wild on the baseball side, plus some Brave shows. I host a Brave show, which people may not know this, but I host a show called Hammer Territory. So if you like the Braves, find that show with my friends Scott Coleman, Sean Coleman, and Stephen Tolbert. Check that out on the Brave side, but lots of baseball shows too. Fantasy football shows on the NFL side. More general NFL shows like the Athletic Football Show with Robert Mays. College football shows, Cover 3 at CBS, the Punt Cast with my friend Robbie Calland, a couple others there. I like sports media podcasts. Like I'm listening to a lot of shows, but like I do listen to a lot of podcasts. And then I always say this, but to wrap it up, there are a lot of Hawks podcasts that I listen to when I can, and there's room for everybody in the space. It's not like competitive or whatever. ATL and 29 is the one I would put first because number one, they're my friends, but it's a really good show. Glenn Willis, of course, Kevin Chenard, and Tyler Jones. All of them have been on this podcast many times. Fun podcast, really different than my show, but really, really good to listen to. Also, Ethos Hawks, Hawks Beat, Hawks Report, Believe in Hawks, Locked on Sports Atlanta. I'm sure there are more. I know there are more, but I should have written this down. My apologies, but lots of Hawks podcasts too. I generally wait to listen to them until after I've done my show because I want to have my own thoughts. But at the same time, good stuff to kind of filter through your ears. So, long story short, I believe in podcasts. I like podcasts a lot. I like the medium, not just the fact that I host two of them. And hopefully that was clarifying. But if you have questions or stuff about, number one, anything, send them to the mailbag. So you can send questions for the podcast or just for me to answer a number of different ways. You can send them to me on Twitter/X. I am at BT Rowland. We are also, as a show, at Locked on Hawks on Twitter/X. Also, you can email the show. It's lockedonhawks@gmail.com. That's lockedonhawks@gmail.com. Also, you leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and leave your question in the kind of comment section of that. Also, if you are a Patreon subscriber of mine, you can send me questions there. It's patreon.com/BTRoller for my non-podcast work, but if you want to get in touch with me, that's a place to do it too. So anyway, that could be mailbag questions, could be one-offs like what podcast do you like, etc. I'll answer that as much as I possibly can. I like to interact with people. And on Twitter, I try to respond to almost everything when I possibly can. So yeah, always fun to interact and do all these. And I really like mailbags. We'll do some more mailbags for sure, both preseason and during the season. And by the way, for people watching on YouTube, I'm wearing my Appalachia High School shirt right now. I'm not trying to get emotional about this, but you might have seen there was a tragic school shooting at Appalachia High School. My brother, who's my best friend, my brother, my sister-in-law, and her mother all teach at the school. We're all present, and obviously the entire community is very much affected. Tragic stuff, awful stuff. So my thoughts are with them. There are all kinds of GoFundMes and supports that you can do there. Prayers if you do that kind of thing, all that. But it's been a tough week plus in that community, in my own community of family and things. Everybody's okay, fortunately close to me, but the community is affected, and sending all my thoughts to them, and hopefully you will as well. All right, that's all I have on today's podcast. Please tell your friends about this show. Please subscribe to the podcast. Nothing probably coming until next week now with some news breaks. But as I said before, we'll ramp it up a little bit more to like 4 or 5 shows per week back in the regular season mode starting next Monday. So please stay tuned, subscribe to the podcast, tell your friends, and we'll see you all next time.